Ben and Rob continue down the same deep, dark rabbit hole into what people originally thought were so-called creatures of myth. In this next installment, we discuss vampires. And we're not talking about the Twilight type. We're talking about good old-fashioned Bram Stoker meets Nosferatu vampires. Blah. So grab a red beverage and sharpen your fangs. We're going to find out if vampires are real or just myth.
Welcome to Edge of Wonder. We're your hosts. I'm Rob.
And I'm Ben.
So all of you were thinking after the witches videos, well then what about vampires? We know, because that was our reaction too.
Two middle school girls, 11 and 12, were arrested in Florida for planning to kill several students in their high school with sharp objects and drink their blood out of goblets.
What? The affidavit said, quote, killing all of these students was in hopes it would make them worse sinners, ensuring that after they committed suicide, they would go to hell so that they could be with Satan. Right. Too many scary movie girls? So is this just an isolated incident? Where do these ideas actually come from?
Not all of you are into these types of things, but you really can't talk about vampires and Satanism without discussing its polar opposite, which in the West is the Bible.
To understand Satanism, you have to understand the Bible. But first, let's define Satanism for everyone. Basically, Satanism is purposely going against the divine in a covenant with evil spirits with the intention of drawing the opposite power from such actions to personally gain and cause chaos.
So what does this mean? I mean, if we're talking about vampires, what does the Bible have to say about blood?
Leviticus 17:10-12, and I quote, "And any man from the house of Israel, or from the immigrants who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood."
Other quotes were found from the Bible we found are Leviticus 19:26, "You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination or soothsaying."
Acts 15:29, "That you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves free from such things, you will do well."
So then it would seem if in the ancient past it was known that the life was in the blood and consuming it would go against the divine, that's what's really going on here.
So wait, are vampires real? We all thought they were just Hollywood fiction, right? Well, we're pretty freaking excited to show you what we found. You're going to learn about a very dark origin that might even make Vlad the Impaler shake in his boots. But don't worry, we'll get to him at some point. So where are vampires from and what are they?
So where did the idea of vampires come from? All of you probably said Vlad the Impaler, right? We all thought that was the first instance, but that's just not true. The legend of vampires exists in almost every culture around the world.
In Europe, they're called a variation of vampires or revenants or Dracula. In China, they're called Guangxi. In Australia, they're called Yaramayahu. And last but certainly not least, in India, there are many. They're called Bhuta, Bhuts, Azrapa, Brahma Parusha, and Rakshasa.
Curious, but why does India have so many names for vampires? There are also different classes of vampires.
Here's a curious quote from Matthew Bunson, author of The Vampire Encyclopedia, who is quoted from a documentary called Origins of the Vampire from A&E. Quote, "The most likely candidate for the birthplace of vampire is the Indus Valley, and that very early civilization dated to the 3rd millennium BC. It was there that we have evidence of the earliest vampire cults, the worship or veneration of so-called vampire gods, or supreme if not highly powerful beings of nature, who were placated and satisfied with sacrifices and offerings of blood," unquote.
In the Vampire Encyclopedia, it says, quote, "Trade, cultural, and religious diffusion, even wars, carried India tales to other lands, ultimately reaching Europe, which had its own traditions of blood and death. The Gypsies, the great nomadic people, added their own contributions to the recounting of such tales, as they came originally from India, spreading across the entire world. Studies of Gypsy communities in Turkey have shown that their origins are actually from India. Further research has shown that by the time Vlad the Impaler was born in 1431, gypsies had already arrived in Romania.
Arnold Payol is arguably the most notable vampire case in history. It took place around 1727 to 1728, with a second epidemic around 1732. Payol was a hajduk in the Serbian military. After serving, he moved back to his hometown of Medunja and basically was near Belgrade.
Apparently, Payol is said to have mentioned frequently that when he was stationed in an area near Kosovo, he had been afflicted by a vampire.
However, in the Vampire Encyclopedia, it said that when Payol got home, the villagers started to think he was a bit strange, especially after showing no interest in an eligible woman at the time named Mina from a neighboring farmer.
To avoid the pressure, he ended up marrying her, but it was never really normal between them. Quote, she finally asked him what troubled him. Payol then recounted a visitation from a vampire. The event took place when he was stationed in Greece. He destroyed the creature, resigned from the military, and returned home, feeling that he was forever after cursed.
As a side note, in some reports we found, it said that Payol had been tormented by vampires all his life. But back to the story.
Not long after this, Payol fell from a hay wagon and broke his neck, dying soon after. But that wasn't apparently the last time people would see Arnold Payol. Stories spread like wildfire that people had seen Payol still wandering around. 4 people at the time reported being attacked by him, and much livestock reported was defiled. The people died 3 days after the attacks.
Villagers couldn't really take it anymore, so they dug up Payol's body. They took the advice of a soldier who had been at such events before, meaning there were more of these in the past.
Needless to say, the villagers were horrified by what they saw. Keep in mind, this is about 40 days after his death. Payol's body was undecayed. They found fresh blood coming out of his nose, mouth, ears, and even eyes. They found that new nails and skin had grown where the old ones had fallen off.
Seeing this was a full-on vampire, they drove a stake through his heart, and when they did, Payol let out an audible groan. And those groans are described differently in different accounts of this, and some were pretty nasty.
I can imagine. Crazy. So fast forward 5 years, and another epidemic broke out in the same village. 17 people died in a time span of about 3 months from what was said were vampire attacks.
The Emperor of Austria finally caught wind of this and sent out regimental field surgeon Johannes Fluckinger to report back his findings. Now you have to keep in mind that Fluckinger and at least 2 of the people sent with him were doctors and had an enormous amount of experience with cadavers. Cadavers are dead people.
I think they understand that. All right, the above account of digging of Payol's body was secondhand information, given as an account to Fluckinger by the people in the village. So you could discount that, except that during the second epidemic, Fluckinger and his team went to exhume a few of these graves even 2 to 3 months after death and found similar things.
These people who had been throttled in their sleep by alleged vampires also had undecayed bodies with newly growing skin and nails, undecayed organs, etc., with fresh blood everywhere.
Keep in mind, every single one of these people died within 3 days, some of them reporting having been throttled by something. 3 days seem to be a common thread in all of these vampire cases.
Indeed. Fluckinger's report is extremely hard to discount for several reasons. Most people argue that in the past our understandings of body decay was insufficient, and all of these were just signs of tuberculosis.
Yeah, it's kind of like, that's not a shark, it's a human.
It's a weather balloon.
It's a rubber balloon. That's a better way of putting it. But one of the bodies who was buried with its baby, who also died, had been half eaten by dogs, and the mother's corpse looked entirely like it had been fresh and feeding on living things.
So these burials don't seem to be very good to begin with. I mean, the burials would need to be pretty bulletproof for a body to not decay after 3 months, even with our current way of doing things.
Now, there are so many cases from this time period that we can get into a lot of them. Many of these cases come from all across Europe, and the vampire culture is extremely strong in the area around Transylvania.
How strong, you ask?
Well, before moving on, let's look at a recent case.
In the documentary Vampire Island by Timeline, a story is recounted from February 2004. In Craiova, excuse me if I'm butchering that, southwest Romania, after a man named Tom Petra died, he was said to have reanimated to feed on his extended family. His relative, Elisabeta Marinescu, is quoted as saying, quote, "I saw him coming at night. He was calling. I was screaming. He was sucking our blood." Needless to say, Tom Petra's corpse was dug up by the family, his heart was pulled out by his own brother with a pitchfork, and it was burned.
It's pretty intense.
That is crazy. Imagine doing that to your brother's corpse.
I can't imagine that. Okay. Well, we actually found through some searches many vampire communities everywhere. Notable were communities in New Orleans, which has a huge culture of voodoo, and another in Chicago, which also happens to be the murder capital of the world.
We also found people who claimed to be vampires, and no case was more interesting than the ex-vampire Bill Schnoebelen.
Now, before we get into this, we ask you to look into this for yourselves. Fritz Springmeier does reference some of Bill's work on the subject matters pertaining to the Masons. We don't agree with everything Bill says, but several things line up with our research so much we decided to include his account.
Bill claims to have in fact been a vampire, but his vampirism didn't come from being bitten and waking up to become a stalker of the night. No.
His vampirism came from being a Satanist. Let's dig into his case.
Now, keep in mind, Bill has credentials to back up several of these things. We're going to give you the shortened version of all of this. Bill was a Catholic minister who was also into Wiccan witchcraft and had a coven. Being involved in these things, he also got himself into seances, eventually getting himself this thing called a spirit guide.
This spirit guide thing got him to all kinds of different trouble. He eventually got himself reading the Satanic Bible and then joined a satanic cult, all while being a Catholic minister.
What the heck?
No less.
Well, moving up in the ranks, he eventually made it to what he called the 7th degree in his cult. His satanic higher-ups at this point gave him a choice. He could either become a vampire and drink of the blood, or become a werewolf and eat of the flesh. What?
Now, we'd have a hard time believing this, save for the fact that this dude is a hardcore Christian. And while we do think he's exaggerating a bit in some regards, his accounts seem to line up with other things other researchers and insiders have found and leaked, like Fritz.
Bill says to become a vampire, he was put through a type of process where he was first made to eat specific herbs and vitamins with a ridiculous amount of cocaine. He learned how to become a psychic vampire first. This is where you draw energy from people.
He apparently felt changes going on in his body, and his blood types forever changed and never went back to what it was, even after becoming a Christian. One night, after doing a ridiculous amount of cocaine, his satanic master came to him and cut his own chest and made Bill drink of his blood.
The cocaine was for a reason, though, apparently. Bill said that his saliva changed into a thick substance full of cocaine and that it would numb skin, which is basically possible because cocaine is a topical anesthetic.
It's true, I guess.
Yeah.
He said that it was then that he became addicted to blood, and that blood is more addicting than heroin. After drinking his master's blood, he was put in a coffin that he built himself for 3 days.
There's 3 days again.
Yeah, it's always 3 days. On the third day, he was able to come out, and it was then that he felt many changes.
So he could no longer eat any food. Anytime he'd try to eat food, he'd throw up. He had to subsist only on blood and Catholic communion, and what he called psychic vampirism, where he'd steal a portion of people's energy by using a talisman. He said this is the reason that Catholic tabernacles have locks on them. People used to steal the communions for these kinds of things and rituals.
Bill went on to subsist on people by only drawing a little of their blood for some time. These were volunteers that he had known from his witch coven. But as time went on, his addiction became worse. He started to want to do terrible things to people to get their blood.
Bill said that he was only a half a vampire at this point, and to finish the process, he'd have to die and then come back immortal, which he had kind of a problem with because he kind of liked being alive.
And I think any rational person should have a problem with that.
Seriously.
Bill eventually got out by getting a compassionate message from someone. He said he had sent in money to the Church of Satan, but the check he sent in was returned by the person at the bank that received the check.
She went ahead and voided it and sent it back with a note on it saying that she'd be praying for him. So after Bill got the check, and it had such a compassionate message on it, he was so moved that he ended up starting to read the Bible more carefully, and he ended up becoming a born-again Christian. I mean, good for him for getting out of being a vampire, because what the heck, that's crazy.
I would definitely say the same thing.
Yeah. Now, Bill has a tremendous amount of stories that he tells in his interviews and lectures. We don't believe all of them because there could be some secondhand information and exaggerations there. But his understanding of the satanic hierarchy and how demonic possession works with these things did line up according to other researchers.
Not to mention the blood sacrificing that happened in India. These demons that they were worshiping in India have many names, but one blanket name is the Asura. What are the Asura? There's a tale that these Asura actually teach you their things, and afterwards you become their species. Sound familiar? So how does possession really work?
But wait, didn't Bill talk about the other path that he was offered? He said that he could have become a werewolf. So are werewolves real? Hey guys, hope you're enjoying this episode.
If you want to watch the rest and get access to our full catalog of content with hundreds of videos that will keep you entertained for hours and hours, subscribe to rise.tv.
Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single new drop.
Yeah, and we'll see you out
On the edge.